This video was brought to you by Brilliant. Wars around the world, ecological disruption, economic crises, mass migration, Islamic terrorism, political polarization, food shortages, nuclear war, North Korea, China, and America. There's a lot that people around the world are worried about right now. But what's considered to be the most existential risk facing the world? Well, new data compiled by KEX-CNC and the Munich Security Conference dives into exactly this, examining which of these risks people around the world perceive as the greatest. So let's unpack the risks and why people are so worried about them. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Before we dive into the data, let's quickly explain how it was compiled. 1,000 people from 11 countries, the G7 and BRICS countries except Russia, were selected for this survey. These specific people were selected to be a representative sample of their respective countries, and their responses were then weighted as to exactly reflect the population quotas. For each of the 32 risks, respondents were asked to rank out of 10 how great they thought the risk was for their country, if they thought the risk would increase over the next year, how severe the risk would be if it happened, how imminent the risk is, and how prepared their country is for it. These scores were then combined and rescaled to produce a score out of 100. With all of this data combined, we end up with this table. Figure 1.5 of the Munich Security Report, the risk heat map. Before we get into the big stuff though, let's start at the bottom end of the table, the lowest risks. The 5 lowest ranked risks, according to the survey, are rapid changes to my country's culture, right-wing terrorism, the coronavirus pandemic, the United States, and the European Union. The US and EU aren't the only countries or blocks on the list though. In ascending order of perceived risk by each country, we have North Korea, Iran, China, and at the top of the list of countries, Russia. Russia is an interesting one though, with different countries viewing Russia very differently. In last year's data, Russia was the biggest risk for 5 of the G7 countries surveyed, but this year only the UK and Japan consider Russia to be the greatest risk, with it in second place for the US, third for Canada, 5th for France and Germany, and 10th for Italy. This doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of the risk posed by Russia though, with their army holding up pretty well in Ukraine and Putin seemingly threatening Baltic nations right now. But it does suggest that as other conflicts and concerns arise, international interest in the conflict is beginning to subside. So with Russia slipping down the rankings and landing in 9th overall, what actually made up the top 5? Well, with an average concern level of 58, in 5th place is mass migration as a result of war or climate change. Now, given the displacement we've seen from countries like Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, and Syria following major conflicts, plus more than 33 million Pakistanis displaced due to flooding not long ago, it makes sense that this is a salient issue. France and Germany rank this concern particularly highly, which is also unsurprising given their ongoing political shifts towards anti-immigration parties. In 4th place, with a concern level of 59, is the risk of an economic or financial crisis. This also isn't all that surprising, as we watch economies continue to struggle post-pandemic and post-Ukraine war. In fact, around the world we're seeing economic growth stagnating, with some like the UK and Japan arguably in recession right now. In 3rd place, with a concern score of 63, is the risk associated with the destruction of natural habitats. In fact, related is 2nd place's climate change generally. Climate has obviously been a major concern for decades now, but as people increasingly see the impact that climate change is having on our lives, it seems that anxiety is rising. That being said, those polled in Germany, the UK, Italy, Canada, the US, and China all rank climate lower than they did last year, so maybe not everyone's got the memo. Then the biggest concern is also climate adjacent, the risk of extreme weather and forest fires, with a score of 64. Particularly concerned are Brazil, South Africa, and Italy, all countries that experienced weather extremes in 2023, including floods, heat waves, and record temperatures. It's unsurprising then that as the tangible consequences of climate change begin to hit, that populations start to worry about the direct and indirect consequences. It's not just this overall heat map that's interesting though. How this data has changed from last year is also fascinating. In fact, two risks have seen their concern levels rise significantly over the last year: the risk of radical Islamic terrorism and the risk of autonomous robots and AI. The rising presence of AI on this list does seem logical, given that new AI models have dominated the headlines in the last year or so, and as technologies like ChatGPT bring the world of AI into our pockets. That being said, although concern about the rise of AI is increasing, it's still only the 21st biggest concern on the list, suggesting that while it's a rising concern, it's still not perceived as an overly pressing one. The same can't be said for radical Islamic terror, which has risen from 22nd to 5th for G7 countries in the last year. This likely follows the Hamas terror attacks of October 7th, as well as the ensuing conflict. Interestingly, this also follows a rising concern surrounding Iran and the Islamic world more generally, which could also have been impacted by the Israel-Gaza conflict. France is particularly worried about all of this, with Islamic terror ranking as their #1 risk, while it's also rising fast in Italy and is the #2 on Germany's list. A few other interesting data points worth noting. The previously pretty nuclear skeptic Germany has seen a slip in their concern level around nuclear and biological weapons. Japan is perhaps unsurprisingly the most concerned about China, while across the board fears surrounding China are actually dropping, actually at a faster rate than concerns about the US and EU are dropping. The British, for their part, are notably less concerned about the economy than they were last year, despite economic concerns rising globally. I can't think of any reason why Britain would be an exception here. While the US's second biggest concern is political polarization, ranking it significantly higher in their list of concerns than any other nation. It's plausible that this could increase yet more this year as the country heads into yet another polarizing election. And finally, China. Well, China's broadly unconcerned. The highest concerns on their list are cyber attacks, climate change, and the US, all scoring 42. But that compares to other countries' highest concerns, which tend to be in the 70s or 80s. Now, this video has been a lot of fear and gloom. So when we were at the Munich Security Conference, the event which actually published this very study, we asked a number of experts what bright spots of hope they had. And this is what they had to say.
Well, what I tend to say, and I'm reminding myself more often these days, is that the world is a messy place. It has always been. And when we feel overwhelmed by all these conflicts and problems and repression, it's just like make one step in front of the other, find the places where you can change things, and just make sure you always walk in the right direction.
Despite everything that's going wrong, whether it's in Somalia or the DRC as well, that there is a sense, among citizens as well, that they have a sense of the direction in which they want to go. So a lot of citizens now speaking up in defense of democracy, in defense of democratization. And for me, that still gives me hope that citizens themselves, despite what their leaders are doing, still want to see democracy flourishing as well.
In spite of the difficulties of last year, there were so many good stories. I mean, we were able to evacuate children from orphanages in Sudan. We were able to create and ensure safe passage for civilians in so many places of conflict. We've been able to significantly improve the situation of detainees in many parts of the world. We are every day accessing someone somewhere. We are every day helping and reuniting families.
One project, and we did it for the second time in October last year. It's a music festival in Mosul. Mosul is the city where ISIS back then had its headquarters. Music was forbidden. They killed people if they only had musical instruments in their houses. And then the Americans, in the end, they bombed down the old city to finally defeat ISIS. And now they are rebuilding the old city. But we were bringing back with this music festival, music in every corner. And we had Christian, Yazidi, Muslim women, men playing together music. And these are the stories also that give hope. And I know a lot of media attention is on the big wars. but there are a number of places and stories that can give hope, and maybe we need to allow them to be more present also in our minds again, so that we don't get the idea that there's nothing we could do, because we can do a lot.
For more of our interviews from Munich, click the link in the description. A lot of stuff in our videos can often seem pretty complicated, especially when we dive deep into detailed data and economics. But there's a fun and easy way for you to learn more about these topics, which doesn't cost thousands of dollars a year or take years of studying. That's because Brilliant is the best way to learn maths, data science, and computer science interactively. And the fun thing is that it doesn't take long to learn either. These complex topics are broken down into small and accessible chunks, designed around your busy schedule, whatever your skill level. That means that if you spend just a few minutes a day, you can gain new knowledge over time in an actually fun way. As time goes on, you'll get used to that feeling of learning too, because it isn't just about sitting down and reading. Brilliant teaches you by doing, using active learning to teach you the principles of otherwise quite complex topics, and ensuring that you understand what's actually going on. So whether you want to brush up on your basic math skills, improve your employment prospects by learning about future technology, or just have fun coding, then you can check out everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for 30 days by clicking the link below. Plus, the first 200 people to sign up will get 20% off Brilliant's premium annual subscription. Thank you so much for your support.